Well, morning, folks. It almost seems a shame to interrupt your wonderful conversations. My name's Matt. It's a real privilege and honour to be here with you all as this morning we gather to celebrate, remember, and honour Charles together. Just listening to the conversations, I know many of you are actually meeting for the first time. It's really obvious that Charles touched many lives in many different areas of life. So absolutely wonderful, and thank you so much for all being here. I hope that you'll feel the warmth of family and friendship that's here in the chapel this morning. We also have family and friends joining us online, so we thank you and welcome. Hope that you also feel the warmth that's here this morning, and it's a real pleasure and privilege to have you joining with us. So we're going to start with a beautiful piece of music. As we know, Charles absolutely loved music, and I'm sure this piece will allow us to just catch our breath a little bit, just to allow this music to wash over us as we prepare to really celebrate just such a wonderful, wonderful gentleman. Thanks, Katie. You know, it's said that love can't be written on paper because paper can be erased, nor is it etched in stone, for stone can be broken. Love, therefore, is inscribed on one another's hearts, and there it remains forevermore. And that's so true for all of you that knew Charles. The love that he gave, what he has given to you, deposited in your lives, what he has received from each of you, remains with you both forevermore. And that's why you're gathered here this morning. He was authentically unique. It's a good way of describing him, isn't it? A true original. Many of you know him as an artist of great talent or as an architect who excelled throughout his career. But he had many passions. He was a keen photographer who documented his life from an early age, and he also played guitar beautifully, loving the classics. A highlight of his life was seeing Andre Segovia in concert and having that program signed by him. He was fascinated by history, astronomy, and building model warships. He also kept antique rifles, but essentially was a man of peace. He was keen to live harmoniously with the world and all of its creatures. He would not hurt or harm a living creature, and surrounded himself at home with nature, his birds, lizards, and possums who visited him daily. Charles' home is a testament to his talent and his uniqueness. He surrounded himself with books, art, and his mother's sculptures. He also collected a great many things. In fact, he didn't like to throw anything out, did he? Charles was an only child who was very much loved by his mother Liz and father Rollo. However, he also had 7 cousins who lived all around the world. Tim, Jay, Nick, Martin, Ben, Ali and Joanna, as well as all their families. He visited his cousins as often as he could, and he enjoyed travelling to the UK, Spain, America and New Zealand to see them all. Today is a day that's full of mixed emotions, isn't it? Because there's sadness and sorrow at Charles's passing, but there's also a desire to remember good times shared and those precious moments that you'll hold on to forevermore. So I'm going to invite Merv Lindsay up to share with us first of all. Thanks, Merv.
Thanks, Matt. It's no doubt, like most of you, I've been privileged to call Charles a friend. And I'm very honoured today to be given this opportunity by Joe and Abra. And I suppose Charles would have wanted me to start by thanking all of you for your friendship, and particularly those of you involved in the last few years when things got pretty tough for Charles. But having said that, he also faced those last couple of years with enormous dignity, as you'd expect. There's Joe, of course, always there when you needed him, and we had a bit of a local support team of Uma and Rob Wilco here, and Tony, and I guess they were the people that he and Naomi, and they were the people that he always knew that he could call on as he needed them right at the end. But also thank all of you who offered. There's plenty of people offered, and who did and would have stepped up when asked, and those who rang him. Those who sent him texts, those who rang and he didn't answer the phone, and those who were asked to come and see him, but he always said, no, wait till I'm a bit better. But of course, with cancer, you never do get better. So, yeah, and And even people who just asked after him, and I always told him when someone asked after him, and he was always chuffed, he always had, oh really, people notice, he's that sort of guy. Many of you have known Charles a lot longer than I have. I've known him half my life, but our close friendship goes back less than 10 years. Joe, of course, knew him all his life, and Bob Donaldson told me 60 years. Wow, 60-year friendship. And thanks to all of you who gave me insights into for this eulogy. Your stories and insights have been a joy to hear, and I wish I had time to include all of them today, but maybe afterwards at Charles's we can chat about a few of the others. As we've said, Charles was an only child of Rollo and Elizabeth, or Liz Martin. He came from very illustrious stock. Charles was what I'd almost call the educated gentry of the past, and adventurers. And as we heard, he had his family were citizens of the world, and he still has relatives scattered around the world. Charles's father came to Australia from the UK, but he was actually born in Japan. And when I date that back, that must have been the end of the 18th century or some time like that, which must have been quite unusual. His father, I think, was a surgeon, or am I right about that? Yeah. He came here to work as a scientist at Lysarts, and his mother was a recognised artist, as we heard, who I believe has work in the Newcastle Art Gallery permanent collection. Charles went to school in Merewether at St Joseph's, and then to Morris Brothers, and then to Newcastle University, and it was when it was at Tyers Hill, and that's where he met Bob Donaldson. They studied together, and whilst Charles's artistic and creative skills were apparently recognised as something very special, in Bob's words, he took a bit longer to graduate because he couldn't pass mathematics. Now, as an engineer who tried to teach structures to architectural students, I'll resist commenting on that, unless you think that might have been a comment. But it actually surprised me a bit, because I actually always thought of Charles as having a very analytical mind, but he perhaps had no interest in maths. I don't know. After graduation, he worked as an architect, mostly here in Newcastle, including a very long and strong association with EJE. And he always talked about the architects that he admired, and he also worked in London for a while, living in London and in Brighton. And I see a lot of you here today who knew Charles the architect. But as we heard, he had many threads to his life. Who was Charles Martin to each of us here? As I said, there's Charles Martin the architect. There's also Charles Martin the son. And I got a sense, even though I'd never met his parents, I always got this sense that he was fiercely loyal to his parents. And Charles the architectural renderer, Charles the artist, Charles the creative historian, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, Charles the model boat builder that we've heard, Charles the classical guitarist, Charles the loner, Charles the gentleman, and Charles the lover of cheap red wine. We heard a bit about Charles the pacifist a minute ago, and I didn't have this in my speech, but I must relate it. Charles, I bought a building just after the earthquake, and Nick Giorgio and Charles moved into the upper level of this building after it was finished. But as I renovated it, I couldn't get rid of the bloody pigeons. And they after we locked them out of the building, they still hung around the outside. And I said to Charles one day, I'll get rid of them, I'll put some rat sack on the windowsills. And Charles was horrified, absolutely horrified. And then one day, overnight, these pigeons just disappeared. And he was absolutely convinced that I'd put the rat sack on the windowsill. And I'm sure he thought that all his life, and I wish to Christ now I'd actually corrected him, because I definitely didn't. But anyway, that was Charles. The Charles I met in the 1980s was Charles the architect, and I think Barney convinced me that the first job I worked with him on was Champagne House, at Peterson's Champagne House. And then we did a residence up in Charlestown for Bob Donald, which seemed to take an eternity to finish. But then I saw how he used his artistic talent to create these artist impressions, which I didn't know about initially. And he did them of the new proposals, and Barney agreed with me that just about all, if not all, of the artist's impressions we saw in the Newcastle Herald through to the turn of the century were from Charles's hand. And Charles actually told me an anecdote. Charles didn't tell jokes, as most of you would know, but he told me in his dry humour an anecdote about one of those artist's impressions, which was the Carrington Bridge. He said that he prepared the artist's impression for the Carrington Bridge for EJE, but when it was done, they hadn't decided what to put on the fixed panels between the handrail posts. So Charles said he just put a few squiggly lines in just for the newspaper, and then he drove over it after it was finished and saw there was his squiggly lines. They'd become the permanent fixture on the Carrington Bridge. But it looks bloody good, actually. Architectural rendering became obsolete with 3D computers, 3D computer-aided drafting. And Charles then turned his hand to understanding the potential of this new technology and using it for a new purpose. Charles, the creative historian, emerged. Now, I'm using that term, I made up that term, I don't know what you'd call it, but that's when Charles and Gioni di Gravio connected around this period, and Johnny apparently had some vision of what he wanted to create, and somehow Charles's skill and Johnny's vision sort of connected, and what came out of that, which is what I believe is Charles's greatest legacy. And I'm not understating that. I am absolutely convinced of that. I know the work Charles did in the work Charles did in creating these 3D images, and I hope everyone's seen them. If you haven't seen them, you must look at them. The 3D images of 1825 Newcastle, they were his proudest achievement. Johnny de Gravio told me that he commenced this in November 2012, and by the end of 2013, what he'd produced made the front page of the Newcastle Herald and a 2-page spread inside. I think Johnny said that he put out a press release, and the Herald were just absolutely stoked with this, and it just turned into something that virtually the subject of that edition. It was amazing, but you should see it now. He had a modest budget to work on, but Charles didn't stop when the hours ran out. He was paid for 34 days to produce something. It's interesting, isn't it? He paid for 34 days, but it took him 12 months. Does that surprise anyone? But he produced something that no other city in Australia has. And that's no exaggeration. Joni says that other cities in the world, like New York, and I think he mentioned another one, have similar imagery, but they spent millions producing it. Charles, 34 days. Now, I've seen Charles continue to improve that model that he produced as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. He just fiddled with it and come up with slight improvements. The value of this to the region cannot be overstated, and we cannot afford to lose it. So its preservation needs to be funded, and Charles recognised that. Which brings me to Charles the artist. Now, I'm up here because I can't believe my good fortune that I have had 10 years of friendship with Charles as Charles the artist. Having Charles as a mentor has been a privilege that I could never have repaid. During the past 6 months or so, Charles regularly kept thanking me. He thanked people for everything, didn't he? That was his nature. You know, whatever you did, he always got a very polite thanks. But he thanked me for the support as his health declined. And every time he thanked me, I reminded him that it was me that had to thank him, because he's taken me on a journey beyond my wildest dreams, but never coming close to his brilliance, of course. I regularly called him the best artist in Newcastle that no one's ever heard of. And I sensed that he actually liked that description. He undervalued his talent, and in my view, he really didn't take it where it deserved to be. He greatly admired his mother's work, but my personal view is I think he was better. As well as other support that his provision to continue his work, Charles gave me a bundle of paintings, about 60 paintings, for an exhibition with the profits to go to the Vera Deakin Foundation to advance his work, the work that he started, and to curate some other documents and photos that he's given to the Hunter Living Histories collection at the Newcastle Uni. And I hope I can find all of you to give an invite to that exhibition when it's on. We're hoping it's going to be in April. I think it'll be amazing. Some of the pictures that have been framed so far just came up looking so good. And I hope it's as successful as I promised him that it would be. Now, did I mention Charles the procrastinator? It wasn't on the list, but I can see that it's a recurring theme, and I sense that it struck a nerve with a few people here. I'd been pestering Charles for almost a year to sign his paintings and select which ones he wanted to exhibit for this exhibit. We actually planned to have this last September while he was still around. Well, he did it. He finally did it the day before he went to hospital for the last time. He signed his paintings and he chose the ones that he thought should be... he chose a short list that I had to pick from, but we virtually picked all of the short list. It's a bit like Ian Eckford told me. He always delivered, but not without some anxiety. But what we have is an amazing and fantastic collection, and they, as I said, they look great framed. At my suggestion, Joe found a bundle of other paintings that looked pretty good, and I suggested she take him in there for him to sign, and he signed them actually the day before he died. Now that's absolute procrastination. Charles, the model boat builder. Charles had a passion for warships all his life, apparently, and many of us would have put together those little plastic models when we were kids. But when you go to Charles' home for the wake, you'd be bowled over by the meticulous attention to detail in what he has produced. Even as the cancer progressed, he was focused for day after day on incredibly complex models that he wanted to finish. And it was a perfect hobby for Charles the loner, who was always happy with his own company. He liked people, but he could do without us. Charles the classical guitarist. Now, just when you think you know everything about a guy, I discovered about 6 months ago that Charles plays classical guitar. Some of you might wonder how I didn't know that, but I didn't. But unfortunately, I've never heard him. But I'm sure he would have been good because he was a perfectionist at everything he took on. As I said before, Charles the son and gentleman, and clearly Charles admired his parents, and I know that he would have been committed to them. I never met either of them, but I know that Charles's respect and grace must have come from them. As I said, he was a true gentleman. Finally, Charles the admirer of cheap red wine. Bob Donaldson told me, Bob's here, isn't he? Oh, there, yeah. Bob told me that about Charles's first trip to the pub with him and a group of other students one day when the lecturer hadn't turned up to class. Probably the Cross Keys, was it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, there you go. Opposite the Tech College. Bob said Charles, the quiet, well-mannered guy who used to get picked up each afternoon by his dad after uni, he really took to it. At times in his life, Charles was too attached to red wine, but he was also intelligent enough to recognise the risks, and he remained in control. But he loved it nevertheless. Rob Wilkinson and I decided to take a bottle of red wine to the hospital to share with Charles. This is the bit I might get emotional. To share with Charles when we knew the end was near. Charles said he wouldn't have any because he was feeling pretty bad by then. I suggested to him, maybe just a sip, Charles. And anyway, so he took that, and after he'd had the sip, he passed me the glass. And I went to take it off him, and he held on to it. He said, no more. So I poured another one. While Wilco had his rum and coke. Over close to an hour, Charles and I shared about 2/3 of that bottle with Joanne, who was also there, and Rob Cave was there, but he didn't have any, which was good for Charles, because when we were finished, Charles asked me if I could leave the bottle. We all had a chuckle, including Charles. Well, he died the next night, and I think for Wilco and I, it was a beautiful memory. So Bob Donaldson shared his first drink, and we shared his last. So it's hard to do justice to a guy like Charles in such a short time. Charles underestimated himself and his many talents in many ways. Humble, as we heard, self-effacing, unassuming, self-contained. But I believe he had a very good life, a rewarding life, and I think a satisfying life. In one way or another, I'd say he admired all of you here today. He also knew our weaknesses, but didn't care too much about those. But if I'm absolutely frank, I doubt he knew how much you and others admired him. I also think that it doesn't matter. He was very comfortable with his own skin. He was an artist, to me a great artist, a mentor, a Novocastrian that Gianni di Gravio once described in the context of that 1825 modelling as a living treasure. A gentleman and a friend. The morning after he died, I saw Uma in the street. She said, "I miss him already." Me too, Uma.
Thank you, Merv. Thank you for really honouring your mate. And you did do him justice. You really did. And it's wonderful, even when you were talking about his relationship and friendship with Bob. That says a lot about someone, doesn't it? If you can sustain a friendship for over 60 years, that says that, it really speaks to the integrity and the character of Charles. So thank you so much for sharing with us. Now, I'm sure you're all enjoying the artwork here and presentation at the front. And I should say, without wanting to embarrass anyone, a huge thank you to Joanna and to Abra for pulling all of this service together and ensuring that we capture as much of Charles's spirit and his character as possible. And so, Abra, you're going to come up and share about Charles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's been really lovely to meet you all and to, find out your connection with Charles. It's just amazing that he has so many amazing friends here today. Anyway, without further ado, the other day, as I was driving along the highway on the way here to Newcastle, I thought, what does Newcastle mean to me? And the thing that struck me was that although Newcastle is a place and a lovely place, Newcastle to me has never just been a geographical location. It can't be defined purely by its geography or its topography or its geology. To me, Newcastle has always been a place defined by people, my family, or specific people, and for me, that has always included Charles. For those that don't know me, let me explain. Although I was born here in Australia, my first memories of my country of birth are actually from a visit back here from America when I was only 4 years old. And it isn't Sydney where I was born that I remember from this visit, it's actually Newcastle. When we moved back to Australia permanently in 1987 when I was 6, it was Newcastle where we lived. My mum and I stayed with great Aunt Liz and Uncle Rollo and my cousin. Well, not my cousin, my mum's cousin. And that was, of course, Charles. It was a bit confusing to me because he was more the age of an uncle. But anyway, with lack of family in our geographical locale, he became my surrogate uncle. My earliest memories of Charles include his rather suave dressing. And, I was very young. During the late 80s, he was permanently attired in beige or white. So we're talking beige or white trousers, beige or white shirts, lots of beige and white shoes, and some very smart leather jackets. And he was just so tall. As a child, I used to look up and just see these long, long legs. He towered over me. And anyway, back to his dress sense. I must say that looking through all of his photos, which has been mine and my mum's pleasure over the last few weeks, we can see that, he's had a real style over the years, and it's really sort of changed. So, in his youth, he was a very, very trendy man, which some of you may find hard to believe now. In his later life, Charles was very fond of checks. And I must say, something really beautiful that happened when he was admitted to the hospital for the last time was he was in these awful clothes. He just was wearing a singlet and had been eaten by the rat that had taken up residence in his home in his absence, and it looked awful. And Mum and I just were looking at him going, oh my gosh. So when he needed a nap, we actually drove down to the shops and bought him a lovely pair of blue pajamas, which we put on him. And clothes gave us comfort at this time. I know that's a funny thing, but it really did, because when we saw him in that blue pajamas, in that blue, it just reflected the colour of his beautiful blue eyes, and it just suited him so well. And that's a really lovely lasting memory that I have of him looking really well in his blue. Another funny thing about Charles, he acquired a very cool car at some point, and it was probably in the late 80s as well. It was a Holden Commodore, and it was his work car from his time at Architect Snell. And the car was very suave. Well, for the first 10 years anyway. But then he kept it and he kept it and he kept it, and I think that at some point it actually had to be towed away. But that was Charles. He never was one to trade things in or throw things out, and he would never give up on anything. He may well buy 10 of something, which we have certainly found, but he wouldn't easily part with any of those 10 items. Another thing I clearly remember from a young age about Charles was his love of classical music. He played the guitar, as we've all heard, but it wasn't pop music that he played, it was classical music on his assortment of acoustic guitars. And, you know, I'm not sure if I actually ever told him enough just how much I loved to hear him play. He was amazing and so good. And, you know, even if I had told him that, you know, in typical Charles fashion, that he would have found a way to worm his way out of that compliment, because he was always so humble. He'd always say that so-and-so was better, and I really wouldn't know, because I have never heard anyone that I thought played better. And that goes for his art too. I look at his amazing watercolours and I think they are so brilliant, even the unfinished ones. His discerning eyes may have been able to point out the flaws, but honestly, I still can't see them. Maybe that says more about me, you may think, but I'm a firm believer that good art is in the eye of the beholder, and I think Charles was an amazing artist. It's fair to say that there will never be another Charles. He was truly unique, truly one of a kind, truly an original. And so when I think of Newcastle, how can it ever be the same without him in it? To me, Charles is Newcastle. Sorry. Newcastle means Charles. He's the embodiment of this place, and as it happens, Newcastle meant so very much to him too. So much so that he dedicated many, many hours, as Merv has already explained, painstakingly and beautifully recreating Newcastle in its earliest days in 3D modelling programs, which he taught himself. And he became quite the master of. Though it is fair to say that a lot of modern technology totally befuddled him also. Anyway, the result was a series of beautiful flyover videos, and as Merv said, if you haven't seen them, you should. He hoped to do so much more, to add to the videos and to be able to depict the change in Newcastle over the years. The loss of his local knowledge is profound and very sad for the community of Newcastle. The last time I was able to see Charles in real life was sadly when we visited him just after Christmas. He was in hospital with COVID, but his thoughts were of making sure that my boys enjoyed being in Newcastle. He wanted them to see it and enjoy it. And I think that that sums up Charles's character as well as his love for this city. To Charles, family was everything. He adored his mother Liz and his father Rollo, as we've heard, and as an only child, he took a very active interest in the lives of his cousins and their children too, including me. In return, Charles was loved by his wider family, who he visited over the years across states and continents. And this is evidenced by the many, many beautiful photos that I've found of Charles as he travelled, and some of which you'll get to see quite soon. It also is encapsulated by the beautiful sentiments I've received, some of which I would like to share with you all now on behalf of our family who are spread all over the world and who aren't able to be here. From Alison Pickford, Charles's cousin in the UK. Geography and circumstance kept my cousin Charles and me apart for most of our lives, but I still feel very close to him, and when we met, relatively frequently, all things considered, it was as though we had never been apart. I loved Charles. He was such an interesting and interested person, kind and funny and extremely talented. His love of animals is legendary, and I think most clearly indicated by his reaction to finding a snake lodging in his letterbox. He simply built a new letterbox so that the snake could continue to live happily in the old one. I feel fortunate that I got to see Charles quite recently in October last year. He wasn't well, but we spent happy days together, which I treasure. I had asked him to paint a picture of my grandson Charlie in the Australian bush and had provided him with some photos. While I was with him, he brought up the picture of Charlie, which he decided to use on his computer. He started explaining to me why that particular picture was suitable. He talked about composition, balance and light. It was a masterclass in the working of an artist's mind. Sadly, he didn't have time to paint it, but the almost fully formed picture in Charles's head, which he had talked about so vividly, I find is sufficient. It was such a privilege to experience that. Thank you, Charles. I love you, Ali. From Jay Pickford, Charles's cousin in Spain. I have half a dozen watercolours and dozens of photographs of Charles. But what I treasure most are the memories I have of him. He was not just a talented artist, but a tolerant and forgiving man as well as very, very funny, by which I mean humorous as well as a little bit eccentric. He always put other interests above his own and was very generous and thoughtful. I informed our friends Per and Sonia, a Danish couple who owned a house in Gualchos, of Charles's death. They had entertained Charles when he visited us. We had a wonderful time together, and Per, whose English is certainly unusual, called Charles Woody Allen. Hopefully not in a dodgy way. Okay. From Ben Pickford, Charles's cousin in America. As a young man, I remember when Charles and Aunt Liz visited Kenya, and they came to Karamoja Farm in the late 1950s. Charles was such a curious lad, and he was proficient with a gun too. Many years later, my wife Mary and I travelled from California to Australia and stayed with Charles in Sydney. We toured the many neighbourhoods around Charles's home. In addition, he took us on a tour of the Opera House, giving us his architectural expert view. We met his friends and visited the pubs and had a great time. After Sydney, we took the train to Newcastle to see and to visit with Aunt Liz. Uncle Rollo was in England at the time. Charles and Liz took us to Gosford Park and many lovely sites in the Newcastle area. Charles also came to visit us in California a couple of times, and we took him all over the place, Yosemite and the Gold Country. He borrowed our car and drove himself back to Mariposa, Columbia, and the other Gold Country towns. He was fascinated by the history. Such fond memories of my cousin Charles. May he rest in peace. Love, Ben and Mary. From Martin Pickford, Charles's cousin in France. I met my cousin Charles briefly in Kenya and again in England when he visited me at the university where I was studying. He did some amazing paintings and drawings of the fossils that I had found. I really appreciated them, and I could see that he was a very fine artist. From Ray Pickford, wife of Charles's cousin Tim in Tasmania and mother of Phil, who's here today. I like to say I first met Charles in the middle of the Indian Ocean along with his mother Liz and Tim, his cousin, whom I later married. Rollo, father of Charles, stayed home in Newcastle. This was in 1960. Charles was about 14 years old and was greatly amused by our romance and often appeared by our side with a wide smile and a "Woohoo, Tim!" Tim had been staying with Liz in Newcastle, and now all three were on their way to Kenya in East Africa, where they would stay with Tim's parents. They disembarked from the ship at Durban, South Africa, where they would start their epic journey by car, 4,415 kilometres. The next time I met the family in Newcastle was when I was taking our three children, aged 4, 6 and 8, to Kenya again by ship. When we called in at Newcastle, we were treated like royalty. Charles was the hero of the day, though, plunging into the heavy seas to rescue our youngest, who had been knocked over by a huge wave. Rollo dried his wet clothes that night by the fire. In the 1970s, we moved house to live in Topsham, a small seaside town on the south coast of England, once virtually owned by family who employed locals in building sailing ships. During this year, one by one, Rollo, Charles and Liz all visited us, and in our last week, it was Charles and Rollo together who came to help me scrub the walls whilst Charles took the children to the local park. Back in New Zealand, we again enjoyed visits from all three of the Martin family between the years of 1970 and 1990, and we always looked forward to seeing them. Charles was a very easy guest, and he and Tim used to laugh a great deal together despite the fact that they were very different personalities. Charles was always considerate with a good store of anecdotes to entertain us. I was also a great admirer of his paintings, his knowledge of early Newcastle, and of course his architecture. Rollo's visits I enjoyed for his stories, for instance of having lived as a child in Kyoto, Japan, where he was free to travel alone throughout the country, amazingly safe for children at the time. Liz was an inspiration for her multifaceted art and craft work. She lectured in art and had a TV puppet show, made murals for school and hospital, and had exhibitions of her paintings, becoming well known and popular in Newcastle. With time, Charles's parents, Rollo and Liz, have gone. Now Tim and Charles have left us, but the memory of their laughter lingers on. May they all rest in peace. From Joanna Pickford, my mum, Charles's cousin in Sydney. As a child growing up in Kenya, I was aware that I had a cousin in a faraway land called Australia. I was familiar with some Australian things such as Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie and Cole's Funny Picture Book, but it seemed very far away. And then when I was 9, an exciting thing happened. This cousin from Australia, named Charles, actually came to visit us. My main memory of him at that time was his ability to take photographs at such a young age, and he had a really good camera. He had a historical interest and eye for what was important to record. He took some great photographs of our farm workers involved in their work and others from around the farm. I next remember meeting Charles in England, and when I was a young adult, and he was too. He would come and visit me, driving from Rottingdean to my flat in London, and he always brought along his guitar. I really got to know Charles when I moved to Australia. Charles became like a brother to me, and he was like an uncle to my daughter Abra. His parents were like surrogate parents / grandparents to us, and they were our Australian family. Charles was always interested in what we were up to and asked for detailed accounts of our adventures, and of course, he always wanted to see photos. Charles was a very kind, generous, Victorian gentleman. He was quirky, eccentric, lovable, and sometimes a very frustrating person, but always interesting and extremely caring, and I loved him dearly. I'd also like to read out some small comments from friends that were sent to me, and the first of which is from his friend of nearly 60 years, Bob Donaldson. I did find a lovely couple of pictures in a drawer that Bob had printed for Charles from many, many years ago, and the caption on this was, "Almost 60 years have passed since we first met. Good times they have been," and I just thought that was beautiful. And in an email from his friend and fellow artist John Carr, he was a gifted artist and will be missed by those he painted with and imparted his skills to. And lastly, here is a poem written by a friend of the family, Carrie, who wanted so much to be here today. Rest in peace, beautiful strange bird. You were timid at first when we met you, suspicious even. Your coloured, slightly dishevelled shirt opened at the neck and buttoned incorrectly. It was Christmas, a family time. We were invited by your cousin after a few years of being trusted friends, an honour we had not taken lightly. You learned we were renovating. You showed us your work. You played your classical guitar. You were special, eccentric, fallible, as all the best people are. Years repeating our mostly annual catch-ups made us respect you more and more. You never let us too close, but one year, after many, you gave us a beautiful gift of your mother's work, a treasure, as you are, Charles, and we will miss you. With love, Carrie and Joseph. Thank you so much again for being here and for listening to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Abra. You covered so much there. It was amazing, to hear of all those different facets of Charles, and all. Thank you for reading on behalf of so many family members and friends too, really honouring him, and your piece at the start too. You were really speaking from the heart and being vulnerable. So thank you so much for sharing with us all. It's really precious. Let's watch the screen for a few moments. We're going to see some wonderful images, which really represent precious memories. And I'm sure as you watch many of these, there'll be some tears, some smiles, and even laughter, and all are okay today as you farewell someone who has meant so much to you as Charles. Thanks, Katie. What a wonderful snapshot of Charles's life. Covered all of the important things, his love of nature and animals and family most of all, and friends. I mean, that smile that he had was so warm, wasn't it? Like, it's so inviting. It really let you know that you were loved, that you were accepted, and he really enjoyed spending time with you, that you were close. Just as James comes and sets up, James, I'd ask you to come and set up. I'm going to read a poem as we get ready to listen to James's tribute to Charles, which will be wonderful. The poem's called Do Not Weep for Me. Do not weep for me, for I have not gone. I am the wind that shakes the mighty oak. I am the gentle rain that falls upon your face. I am the spring flower that pushes through the dark earth. I am the chuckling laughter of the mountain stream. Do not weep for me, for I have not gone. I am the memory that dwells in the heart of those who knew me. I am the shadow that dances on the edge of your vision. I am the wild goose that flies south at autumn's call, and I shall return at summer's rising. I am the stag on the wild hill's way. I am just around the corner. Therefore, the wise weep not, but rejoice at the transformation of my being. Thank you, James. Thank you, James. I'm sure everyone feels quite a soothing calmness there. Thank you for sharing your gifts and talents and really honouring Charles today. In just a few moments, we're going to conclude our time here in the chapel. There'll be tea and coffee and some light refreshments out in the foyer area. You're all welcome to stay. I hope that you'll share lots of wonderful memories and stories of Charles. And then, of course, in your booklets there, you'll see you're all welcome back to Charles's place for a week. And there'll be more stories and more wonderful memories to be shared, I am sure. Just in closing, I know that you're all thankful for the privilege that you've had of sharing your life with Charles. I'm sure that's something that's going to remain with you in your heart for many, many years to come. I'm going to read Psalm 23, and there's real comfort to be found in these words, and I think given Charles's love of nature, his eye for detail, this seems to really fit. So it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup, it overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." You know, today has been a real celebration of the love that you shared with Charles and that he has deposited in all of your lives. Can I ask us all to stand, please, for a short closing prayer, and that will conclude our time together. Thank you so much for your love, for your warmth, and for your attendance. For those watching online, thank you for sharing this beautiful moment with us this morning. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, we give thanks for Charles's life. Just as he is now at peace, may each of us know your peace, a peace that goes beyond circumstances and emotions, a peace that protects our hearts and our minds and provides assurance of eternity with you. Amen. So we simply say, rest in peace, Charles.